Another episode of the Square and Compass podcast. Finally, getting back to doing recorded podcast after a long run of live streams. But I guess I can't complain too much of the live streams. It worked out well because I ended up meeting my friend who's with us here today, Cori or Cor Schaefer from Black Raven Meditation. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Cameron.
So you discovered Square and Compass Promotions through the live streams, which was really, really cool. I'm happy that you discovered it that way. But, through the course of the live stream, we started chatting about spiritualism and Freemasonry and potentially some of the ways that certain spiritual practices can assist Freemasons and Freemasonry in its meetings and with its membership. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but what I loved about it is the emphasis that was placed on kind of the practical benefits and the practicality of spiritualism as opposed to some of the what can often start to feel very like esoteric conversations, a word that pops up in Freemasonry as well, but actual like practical steps that can make a Masonic meeting a better experience, can make a Masonic journey better, but can also really be of benefit to almost anybody or really to anybody. So before we get into that, though, I just wanted to take a few minutes. I know you sent me your kind of information, a little bit about it, but tell us a little bit about yourself. I understand you've been practicing spiritualism or studying it for at least 4 years now, but tell me about kind of your journey, what Black Raven meditation is, and your journey in spiritualism.
Black Raven Meditation is we call it a cooperative because the way it's set up. But the whole point is I'm basically a traveling metaphysician, which means that I utilize experiential meditation to help people live their life with a bit more grace and ease. So, because of the way our template is set up, we use all sorts of modalities. We meet with each person and assess that person where they are that day, because we find it more effective whenever we're in the emotion to work through emotion. So, yeah, we use Eastern mystery type divinations and energy work processes and just kind of help guide people to their own self sovereignty. We've Spiritualism comes into that. Um, I was working in mainstream medical in the form of recovery. And they had let me do some of my more esoteric work in there, and it was working really, really well. And also because it was esoteric, it wasn't necessarily given free range. In the process of that, Black Raven Meditation was born, and I took my 20 years of education and turned it on its head and turned it holistic. And now we're taking that holistic aspect back into the mainstream in the form of bereavement and recovery mainly.
Well, let's start with some definitions, right? Which again, you sent me some in advance, but instead of me reading them out, we'll get them from you, right? We'll start with spiritualism. How would you define spiritualism?
On the spot, I need to get my notes out. So spiritualism basically is it. Spiritualism is a group that focuses on proof of spirit communication through means of divination. So that may look like seances, that may look like tarot readings, that may look like open messages, flame messages. It looks all kinds of different ways. But the whole point of spiritualism is to prove the continuity of life. And it differentiates. I want to put this out there in the beginning so that we don't get people confused as we go forward. Whenever sometimes people will be like, "Well, I'm spiritual," and they kind of connect spiritual with spiritualism, and to say one is spiritual is kind of like the foundation of spiritualism. Like that's kind of what the acknowledgement as you walk in the door, and you're developed through there. So there's a doctrine that goes to being an actual spiritualist.
And you mentioned in the information you sent to me, right, there are approximately 154 spiritualist camps throughout the United States.
That are still active, yes.
Um, do you know how many? I was curious when I read that. Do you know how many there exist in Canada at the moment?
I don't know how many exist in Canada. I don't.
I'll have to look that up. Maybe I'll see. Anybody knows, put it in the comment. Let me know.
Yeah.
What I found so interesting about that is it kind of ties in a little bit to Freemasonry and many other groups, right? In the sense that for a lot of people, there tends to be this idea that there's a kind of a worldwide governing body that's setting the rules for Freemasons around the world, as opposed to the jurisdictional model we have, where it's every state has its own jurisdiction and will set its own rules. And it seems like with spiritualism, it's the same idea. Like these 154 camps, to my understanding, each one will set its own rules, but there will be, I also understand, I'm sure, some type of recognition between the camps as to what's a legitimate camp and what is illegitimate.
Yes, so there's different memberships throughout many of the camps. They used to be more um, more camps used to hold the same membership, and as things progressed, people would break off and build their own membership, but they still consider the ones that they broke off from with sister locations. So they're still there, but they're a little separated, and the membership is different for most of them.
And what would you say are some of the consistent qualities between the different sister camps that would make them, uh, for lack of a better term, in Masonic terms, we call them regular, but legitimate, or like somebody would coming from spiritual camp A would be recognized in other spiritual camps, right? What are some of those common elements?
That's a great question. Mainly the Declaration of Principles and the acknowledgement of universal law or natural law.
So I have those declaration of principles here, which you sent out. Um, if I'll go through them, and maybe we can talk about some of them as we go, or if there's anything that you want to add in there as I go through them. We believe in, so these are declaration principles which are kind of required by a spiritual camp to be recognized as legitimate, or one of the ways you'd recognize them as being legitimate. A belief in infinite intelligence, a belief in the phenomena of nature, both physical and spiritual, as the expression of an infinite intelligence. Um, so again, Masonically, you could talk about this in terms of a supreme being, for example. We affirm that correct understanding of such expressions and living in accordance therewith constitute true religion. The existence of a personal identity of the individual continues after the change called death. That communication with this is my cat. I don't know if my cat's in the camera at all. And now my cat's gone. The that the highest morality is contained in the golden rule. Whatsoever you would do that others should do unto you, do ye also unto them. The moral responsibility of the individual, and that we make our own happiness or unhappiness as we obey or disobey nature's physical and spiritual laws. We affirm that the doorway to reformation is never closed against any human soul, here or hereafter. That the precepts of prophecy and healing contained in the sacred writings, including the Bible, or any supreme or volume of sacred law, you might say, of the word, are divine attributes proven through mediumship, and then at least 18 years of age to join in most associations, which is pretty typical amongst many groups, Freemasonry included. Most have 18 as the age, some 21. An expectation of support by membership. So those would be the declaration of principles that you sent to me.
So that sounds like a lot.
Not
So
that
just
many. I mean, there's nine, which to me isn't that many at all, and they all seem to kind of focus on the same basic tenets. Um,
yes, yes.
you know,
That's what
I guess my question would be, because again, this is something that pops up in many different. We've had this discussion on the live stream, right? An infinite intelligence. As a spiritualist and somebody who practices spiritualism, how would you define infinite intelligence? And is that definition going to be consistent, or is it more in the sense of everyone can kind of define it for themselves?
so in my experience, I'm just going to talk from from me for a second. I, I intelligence is in everything, right? And all has intelligence, and therefore it's an infinite plan, right? Because the intelligence itself works up and works down, so therefore it's all one. And I'd say most people who are spiritualist would agree that all is one. And that's kind of the premise we all walk from, even though we will call it different things. Like some people will call it Great Spirit. You'll hear Mother, Father, God a lot when people speak of it. And also, there's always that blanket understanding that we're talking about the understanding that it's all working together as one and it's all an integral part of the whole.
The To what extent does that tie in? So this idea of an infinite intelligence or belief in an infinite intelligence,
Mhm.
what does that look like? Would you say in spiritual camps practically? So do you have a situation where you may have different people coming to a camp with different volumes of the sacred law, different holy books, different even could be considered like a totem or emblem, or different emblems of faith? Um, what type of like what are the practical kind of aspects of the infinite intelligence?
So yeah, there's a vast study. But as we read in the Declaration of Principles, our true religion is the understanding of the operation of the totality of the whole. So we'll see a lot of studies and things like um, on our camp specifically. We have 9 pillars that include a lot of Eastern mysteries. So Osiris. Um, Gautama, Siddhartha, uh, Lao Tzu, Muhammad, Jesus. I know I'm going to forget some and be banished probably, but
I'm sure
um,
you'll be okay.
um, Zoroastrian. Um, there's 2 more. They're going out of my left ear at the moment. But so, it's very diverse in the studies itself. But again, it's all under the understanding that all the sacred texts hold a message. And if you noticed by who I named on the busts of the pillars that we have, they're all considered messengers. If we step back from the name and we step back from the mythos, they're all considered messengers, right? Muhammad was a messenger, Jesus was a messenger, Osiris was a messenger, Buddha was a messenger. So we don't focus on the person, we focus on the message that they're sending and how that message relates to our knowing, like an individual's knowing of the process of how it fits into infinite intelligence.
So one of the pillars I really liked, and I wanted to delve into a little bit because I think it's, um, and I like the message behind it, and I think there's a lot of value in it. Is the seventh, the moral responsibility of the individual, and that individuals make their own happiness or unhappiness as they obey or disobey um, physical and spiritual laws. So could you delve a little bit more into that idea, especially the idea of making one's own happiness and what that means? Because I think in just my experience, it seems so often that there's this idea that happiness or unhappiness is like an external force that kind of, if we're unhappy, it's because something made us unhappy. If we're happy, it's because something outside of us is making us happy, as opposed to kind of an internal responsibility, if you want to look at it that way, or more responsibility. Um, so, from a spiritual perspective, what does happiness look like? What does unhappiness look like?
So from a spiritualist perspective, and you kind of hit it right on the head, it's about taking that personal accountability and responsibility for your choice to choose your state of mind, right? And that is happiness. Happiness, as it pertains to the studies, is kind of fleeting, right? It's kind of a desire that's almost unattainable because happiness looks different for everyone. But you can choose your state of mind. And what that principle is telling us is as we work with the natural laws and as we understand how they are processed and output through our own systems, and we see the manifestation of it. It is our choice to see it for what it is and to make, to pull it in, process it, make the 3-degree adjustment, move again, see the process play out, pull it back in, make our 3 degrees and move until we get to a place that it's like, okay, this is good. Like I can handle it here. Like me on the inside, not out here, right? Not trying to control out here, but whenever I'm okay, I can sit in this space comfortably. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It does absolutely. And I think, for better, my view has always been for better or worse, right? We are kind of responsible for trying to make our own happiness as much as we can.
Yeah.
And that can look like different things to different people, right? But I think just like you're saying in the principles, right? It's not happiness isn't an external force. Happiness is an internal decision. I think you could almost argue, right? Which
Yeah.
we all kind of have to make every day in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Why I always hated the movie Office Space because I think it's the opposite of that approach. Um,
And I think what you said earlier today on your live as well, and anyone who hears this, go back and watch that live. I think it was a really, really good live, a lot of good stuff in there. It's about making that choice, right? That merry we meet and merry we part. Like I can make that choice when I walk in a room to decide to be that, right? To just walk in and be merry and decide that whenever we leave here, we're going to be merry too. And we can maintain that state of presence within ourselves and carry it through, regardless of what's going on outside of us. And I think especially when we're talking about things like Freemasons or spiritualists, where we are in communities of people, it might behoove us all to be mindful that sometimes it's just okay to marry we meet and marry we part. It doesn't really have to be too much more difficult than that.
well, happy to meet, sorry to part, happy to meet again is a common Masonic refrain. So
Oh, really?
yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
And so no, I think that absolutely makes sense, right? And I think again going back to what we're talking about with these um the principles, the landmarks, obviously even the idea of the golden rule, right? And the idea of that being the highest morality is contained, right? It's such a simple way to just live life. It gets complicated as everything does, like the Kantian and things like that. But I think generally speaking, right, it's such a simple and obvious place to kind of start. And it just
Yeah, and
does make a lot of sense, right? The duties you owe to other people. And I noticed that so much of this, the Declaration of Principles, much of it seems to be about not so much the duties one owes to oneself, but the duties one owes to other people, right? Or the idea again of the golden rule, the more responsibility of the individual to make her own happiness or unhappiness. So it's not about others, it's about how you treat others, right? And presumably 6 and 7 connect to each other in that way, because I would assume um, if you are treating others as you would want them to treat you, right? That is the the natural law you're discussing, and that will result in making one's own happiness.
an addendum to that is also don't treat others the way you wouldn't have treated upon you. And I think sometimes that one hits us a little harder because we always think, oh, well, if I treat people like this, but sometimes we fail to be mindful of how we wouldn't want someone to treat us, and
That
to
is true.
not,
Both are equally valid. We should probably
y-
try to keep in mind both of those things.
yeah. Um, and also, it's trying to choose my words wisely here. Whenever once again it's that whole thing of, and you said about treating others, so in spiritualism there's no other because it's all infinite intelligence. Like you are no different than me, you are me, I am you, I'm not here, I'm over there, right? So it's about that deep understanding that since divinity, since the relationship, the knowing of that relationship of essence and energy is here, that I see it in you. I see it in a blade of grass. I see it in a moth. Therefore, I wouldn't treat you anything other than divine.
And I think that that does make, I mean, I think that that does make a lot of sense, right? And you can call it karma. I mean, there's different terms for it, right? But the idea that I kind of I maybe because I loved sports movies growing up or whatever it is, I tend to view it's like being alive kind of by default, you're kind of part of team humanity, right? And it makes no sense to harm anybody else on the team because ultimately then you're just harming yourself because you're just hurting the team that you're on, right? Um, I think sometimes it's hard for people to view it that way. I remember hearing a really neat study that came out. I forget where it was, but it was this idea of like human beings have a tendency to compare themselves or define themselves against another. So it was like it was a school, it was a classroom of kids, and when the teachers were in the room, they defined themselves as students opposite of the teacher. But then when the teacher left, they defined themselves as boys and girls. They stopped defining themselves as students because there was no other, right? So then the definition switched. So it's interesting to see what seems to me like one group in particular, spiritualism, or one philosophy or belief system kind of attempting to fight against the tendency of human beings to kind of um, that tendency we have, right? It's very hard for people to think of themselves as being part of team humanity. They tend to be much more likely to think of themselves as part of a smaller team against something else.
I think that, yeah, that's very, very fair, right? And another, a challenge within that is, when we start learning spiritualism and stuff, and when we start going through our shadow work, to release the tendency to say, this happened to me. This person did this to me, right? And because that's another form of separation, right? When we say this is happening to me, like not that I'm, rather than I'm experiencing this, right? Like my inner self is experiencing this, and that's information for me. So it turns the perspective on what's happening, and it allows us space to say, where's the cause in this, and do I have a cause in it? And if so, how do I best work forward through this dynamic in myself to create the change in the environment that I want to see?
So speaking of work, because everything involves work, everything worth doing involves a certain level of work, right? One thing we discussed, and this is kind of really why I want to get you on the podcast because I think there's a lot of value in this, again, the quote unquote practical side of things, the idea of incorporating meditation into Masonic meetings, right? Because that
Mhm.
came up in a couple, and I've for a long time have been thinking about ways in which we can incorporate more healthy practices into Freemasonry.
Mhm.
It could be like even exercise or physical activity of some sort, stretching, breathing exercises, but also the idea of meditation. I think there's a lot of value in that. So, first of all, and I know we talked about this a lot offline, and I'm excited to talk about it on this podcast. How would you define meditation right off the bat? Because a lot of people, I think, have this idea that you have to sit alone in a room for 2 hours until you experience some breakthrough, right? But how would you
They
define
do.
meditation? What is meditation?
They do often think that. And so with Black Raven Meditation, we teach that meditation is the awareness of choice, right? It's the awareness to choose my state of mind. It's the empowerment of knowing that if I go wonky, right, that I can become aware of that and I can bring myself back to the state of which I want to continue forward. And meditation, we teach all kinds of meditation. We teach the sitting kind of meditation or passive meditation. We teach active meditation. It kind of depends on what the person needs in those moments. We teach mindful exercises, which is also meditation. Because anytime we're present with something, anytime we make that choice to be present with something, we are in an active state of meditation. Anytime I'm engaged and I make that conscious choice to take a breath and come back to the room, like come back to my own body, right? My own engagement. That is meditation.
What does a group meditation look like versus an individual meditation?
Group meditations will literally just be a group of people. Um, Generally, you'll have a set thing you work on because of the group size. So most of the time when we teach group stuff, it'll be a class or something that we've already designed and people that's what they want to experience. When it comes to working with people one-on-one with meditation, we meet with you, we do an assessment of kind of what's going on, what ended you up at our table today, and then we kind of move forward through there. Most people that we work with, I always start them with two things. 2 minutes of meditation for 2 weeks. That's it. Just 2 minutes a day, right? Because it can be destabilizing for some people, like you said, to like sit too long or to like, because they get overwhelmed in the thought processes. So we do the 2 minutes of meditation to get them started and generally give them a mindful exercise to take for those 2 weeks as well to see if they can implement it in and kind of work people into a process of more day-to-day meditation instead of this place that they're going, right? Because meditation is supposed to be about bringing us to the present. Um, so, but those are kind of some of the differential factors as far as BRM goes.
So in a situation where, excuse me, in a situation where, and we'll use Freemasonry, though many groups this would apply to, right? In a situation where you have a Masonic meeting where maybe you have between 10 and 20 people in a room, could be as many as 30 or 40, but usually I would say 10 to 20 is a safe bet. You have the 10 to 20 people in a room and they're gathering for let's say the business meeting, which is just what it sounds like. It's reading of minutes, reading of correspondence and letters, paying bills, announcements, upcoming events, right? So you have kind of your typical administrative meeting. You have the members present. Um, you assume the meeting will last for maybe an hour to an hour and a half, right? What type of meditation or meditations could be done in that setting? I mean, you mentioned 2 minutes is all it takes. So would it be 2 minutes at the start of a meeting, 2 minutes at the end of the meeting? What would you suggest? And then in terms of guiding, if you have nobody present who's guided a meditation before, would there be recordings, worksheets, things that they could use or that the worshipful master could give to a Mason to guide and use as the guide to that meditation?
So, in my personal experience, when in the scenario that you've laid out, I would personally do 10 minutes at the beginning of the meeting. So, literally get everyone in, get them seated, and go directly into the meditation. And that meditation could look very much just like breathing together because breathing together brings the room together. It brings all of us present together. And that alone can be very beneficial for the group purpose, often linking each other without even really realizing it, which can make it a little less abrasive sometimes if there's things that we're there to talk about that might be a little more heavy for the group, right? And also, yeah, you can do guided meditations. There are people who guide them just intuitively. There are people you can buy written. People will make you meditations. We write a lot of meditations for people, individuals and groups. You can go online and just type in, whatever the type of meditation you want. So, like if you want a meditation for like serenity or um, to maybe give insights or stimulate certain aspects of a person of the group psyche, there's meditations for all of those things.
And you kind of touched on it a little bit, but go into more detail. What are some of the benefits you would see to an organization who would start a business meeting with a meditation, either for the meeting itself and just that one particular meeting, or more in general for the group from that meeting and moving forward, and the benefits you might see accrue if you're doing these meditations at the start of every meeting?
Yeah, starting the cool thing about starting meditations at group things is that sometimes we incite in people the curiosity of meditating outside of the group. And that's where the real money's at, is whenever people really bring the meditation into themselves and start moving forward with it. And also, if people just aren't there yet, 10 minutes, a day, a week, a month, a year even can be beneficial to a person's body. Meditation itself um, brings down cortisol. It opens up the respiratory system. It's good for the heart. It's good for the mind. It's good for blood pressure. It works a lot with the diaphragm, which works with digestion and the bladder. So, I mean, it really has this kind of all-encompassing health benefits to just introduce it in any way we can. Obviously, with the hope that people will find some spark of inspiration in it and take it with them and really pull it into themselves and do something with it.
And I know you touched on this as well, but you suggested the for a meeting like as described, right? Doing it at the start as a general rule for most of these type of meetings, because that's the majority of what Masonic meetings are. There's also degrees, again, which is the more ritualized aspect of it. Um, but for most of these types of meetings, would you recommend anything involving like administrative functioning? Would you recommend the meditation, excuse me, be at the start of the meeting for that reason?
Yes, and also if you're a person who's in higher level in business, also my suggestion is take 2 minutes throughout the day, when you're typing or you're getting in the things and you just come to the awareness that you haven't taken those 2 minutes and breathe because it'll bring the stress level down. And when we bring the internal stress down, we don't feel so tired because a lot of times all that energy from out here gets built up in the physical body. So just by taking, 2 minutes to breathe throughout the day or taking 10 minutes with the what do you guys call it there? The committee? You don't call it a committee.
I mean, it could be uh, the lodge,
Okay. And
I mean, there's different committees that pop up. There's a chamber, right? I mean, I would say maybe chamber reflection could be kind of the reference,
okay,
or
so
the committee of general purposes that pops up a lot.
when you do it on that level, you can, and you do it as a group, what you do, you actually build a stronger group too, because all these people who are in power positions are becoming very vulnerable with each other all of a sudden, right? Because we're sitting in a room, we're all relaxing, we're all really opening up. When we're in positions where generally we tend to stay more closed because there's responsibilities or there's things that, we have to tend to that, uh, might not always be obvious to everyone else in the group. Um, so yeah, I mean it there's the oddity or the nuances within it have structural and organizational benefit, and also it can work throughout the entire realm. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely it does. Yeah. The um and I do want to touch on this a little bit more. You mentioned the resources. Any resources in particular you would recommend for, let's say, a lodge that wanted to include meditation, a 10-minute meditation at the start of a business meeting? I know you said there's lots online going to Google finding. Was there any in particular? I mean, certainly, Black Grave Meditation. You guys, I believe, have some worksheets that you told me about, or some guided meditations. But what are some of the resources and places to look that you would recommend, especially if it's for somebody who says never guided a meditation before?
Um, Depends on the type of meditation you'd want to do, but I'm a personal big fan of Ram Dass's work because he does a lot with what we call metta meditation, which is loving kindness meditation. So it just deals a lot with the heart and being present, which has profound impacts. And you can, once again, it's one of those meditations that, regardless of where people are at religiously, intellectually, professionally, it it'll penetrate all the way down through there. So meta meditation, by the way, is METTA, that we're talking about here, which is a Buddhist type of meditation.
And would you consider so would you consider like is the 10-minute meditation, does that also include and involve breathing techniques and directed breathing, or is that a separate thing as well that comes after the meditations? Like, for example, the resource you just mentioned, does that include like square breathing, for example, or different breathing techniques, or is that a separate uh, separate to the meditation that maybe you could be included as part of it or come after?
So a lot of meditations, if it's already pre-done, it'll probably have a certain breathing technique that you implement within it. And also what you'll see is all of the breathing techniques are implemented in some way into meditation.
I remember when I was back in my more student days of professional wrestling school, and whenever you get tired, the coach would just yell "breathe" at us. So that's whenever I think of breathing exercises, that's what I think of, just some guy yelling "breathe" at me as I'm
I do that to
dying in
people
a corner.
sometimes too.
But it works. You breathe.
It
It's
does.
funny when you get stressed, you stop breathing. So you need somebody to remind you to breathe sometimes.
Yeah. I'll just message people sometimes. I'm like, "You breathing over there today?" And they'll be like, "Ah, not yet. Okay, you're right. I'm doing it now."
It's good advice. It's good advice. Just
Yeah.
breathe is very, very good advice and oftentimes underappreciated advice. Sometimes that's the most important thing to do. So yeah, I did. That was kind of where I really wanted the focus of this podcast to be, because I mean we talked about it online. I think again, there's so much in Freemasonry. And don't get me wrong, I love Freemasonry, but it also drives me crazy sometimes. And there's so many opportunities I feel like we're missing out on. And the meeting time and potentially involving things like meditation and directed breathing, I think is one of them. And I think there's oftentimes people are so busy they may not have opportunities to engage in that outside of an actual Masonic meeting. So I did appreciate the discussions on that, and I think I would recommend any Masonic, especially worshipful master, but anybody who wants to bring something new to the lodge, check out Black Raven Meditation. I'll leave a link down below and maybe get some resources, and yeah, consider bringing it up in your lodge and trying to do it. I think it'd be very helpful.
And something, if you don't mind, an addendum of what you just said too. You were talking about bringing the vision together. Meditation is a great way to help groups bring a vision together. Because we walk each other, we basically walk through a an experiential journey inside, creating a canvas, and on the canvas we see things, right? And so when we come out of meditation together, whoever's facilitating the meditation would say, okay, who would like to share their canvas? And sharing, people sharing what they saw on their canvas, what the facilitator can do is going to get a good understanding of the umbrella that everyone's functioning under. And then we can say, okay, what's our goal here together? And then we can use that umbrella information to work towards that goal. So once again, even though meditation seems like such a just this little thing, it can really be used to blossom the flower of what we're trying to accomplish together.
Great things are just little things combined on one another. So and now kind of going back to the more esoteric side of things for a second, right? Because as you pointed out when you in your email to me as well as in our discussions, right? There have been various connections between Freemasonry and spiritualism throughout, I guess, 150, 200 years, give or take. I mean, depending how you want to define when it starts, right? Freemasonry, again, it gets an whole thing, but for the purposes of this, we'll say 1717 is when Freemasonry, the Grand Lodge at least, began. I understand that spiritualism um, as like a movement began in the 1840s. But so you've seen, for example, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle,
Mhm.
Mason and spiritualist. We talked about him today. Also, every Mason's favorite Mason, which is not true at all, but some Mason's favorite Mason, Albert Pike, seemed to, I don't know if he was ever officially a spiritualist, but seemed to have spiritualist tendencies and morals and dogma. Um, you know, from your perspective, an outsider to Freemasonry, although you have Masonic friends you're telling me about, why do you think you have seen these connections between spiritualism and Freemasonry? What would you attribute some of that to?
Potentially the intentional cloaking um, on, both sides, right? Um, so, hmm,
Although
sometimes
what's
I,
interesting about that though is, I mean, famously Harry Houdini, right, was very anti-spiritualist, and he was himself a Freemason, and so I think that's a really interesting kind of. I don't know the connections are interesting, and certainly we'll start with Albert Pike. Like I said, he's one of those Masons that is used on both sides of it to both promote Freemasonry and also Masonic detractors will sometimes quote some of his stuff, oftentimes out of context. But what is your understanding of Albert Pike's kind of not Masonic views, but spiritualistic views, and how does spiritual community view Albert Pike? Because I know you talked to me a little bit about him before and some of the things he wrote.
so I don't know how the spiritualist community sees him, but I personally study spiritualism in addendum with other belief systems, and my personal take on it is, there's when you get into the group, especially when you start adding spiritualism, there can be a tendency, and you've talked about this many times on your podcast, for people to attempt to utilize these practices to benefit themselves or to benefit the group, even. And a lot of times you'll see spiritualists or in the utilization of that process to kind of create a little bit of mystery, create a little bit of intrigue, as well as offer that sense of grief counseling, because that's a big part of spiritualism. That's one of the main parts of it, is helping people with grief, which, as you see from the history, it came around wartime whenever the people who were used to having what we used to call good death, which means when you died, you were surrounded by your family. And even if you were a warrior, you were always brought home, you were honored by your family, and you were put to rest. Whenever the wars started coming in, we didn't see that anymore. And because we didn't see that anymore, what we started to see and what the government started to notice was a shift in the people starting to retaliate against the government because now their husbands, their sons were lost. And spiritualism kind of came in and gave that support to the everyday people in the grief of the loss of those people. And it went very much into Freemasonry, because there's a lot of people in Freemasonry, just like there is in spiritualism, that are, they do big things. So in that doing big things, they were bringing in other big people to do these seances and grief support. And Houdini, he's an interesting one too, because like I said, I think him and Doyle, going back, I know I'm switching subjects on you real quick, but him and Doyle I genuinely feel both of their hearts were in the best place. And also Houdini saw Doyle and spiritualism as frauds, and I think Doyle saw Houdini as being like, an anti-Sayer, right? Like, but they both had an understanding, because in Houdini as a magician, he was trained in a magic school. So he saw a lot of the what he would the protocol in the magic school being used by spiritualists. Because just like when not everyone goes into Freemasonry for the right reasons, not everyone goes into spiritualism for the right reasons. So that ego part of it is the huge determiner of what that looks like, whether spiritualist or Freemason, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that is a really fascinating topic, which I have to do more research on, but I wouldn't even mind doing a live stream about it. The battle between Doyle and Houdini, right? First because I think it helps bring into light one of the misconceptions about Freemasonry that even Freemasons have, but certainly anti-Masonic people have, which is that we're all on the same page all the time, as opposed to the truth is, which is I'm sure true in the spiritualist community, right? We're all people, and so fights happen. Fights between brothers are famously, sometimes more vicious than even or sisters than other fights. And so it's very possible to have two Masons, publicly Freemasons, having ill feelings towards one another and having disagreements. And that stuff happens all the time. It's just Doyle and Houdini happened to be very high profile. So it became more well known. And then I do wonder how much of Houdini's concerns or anger was directed towards um, the potential for fraud and abuse he might have seen from people who were taking advantage of the grief of others, right? Like the Ouija boards, right? How that started after the Civil War. Um, I do wonder if that played a part in it because I don't know all the I don't know off the top of my head the type of death Houdini experienced. I understand he was an orphan, if I recall correctly. No, that was Chaplin. I don't know, but I do know that Arthur Conan Doyle, he lost a lot of people. He lost his wife, his first wife. He lost several people in war. So could that have led him, as you said, grief to a more spiritualist point of view? Um, Whereas Houdini, again, like you said, he was trained in magic. He saw how illusionists worked. I don't know the type of grief he experienced in his life. No one gets out without some grief, but I don't know if it was as much as Doyle, and that may have differed his views on it.
And that's an important thing to point out too. For anyone who looks into spiritualism or spiritualist, you will find a long laundry list of deception. The Fox sisters themselves, who are kind of given the credit for bringing spiritualism to the United States, which isn't really accurate. They were just useful in the implementation of it, even though spiritualism had been going on, had been building for a significant amount of time before them. And also, they had come out 30 years into their career and admitted that they were frauds. Um, there's many books on these things that are records of not only other people seeing that fraudulent activity, but people who were actually involved in it, who turned around and said, "Here, these are all the tricks," right? Um, and tried to just completely out them because once again, depending on your journey when you go into it, um, you know, the deception part is something that we all have to be aware of and to not be naive. That's probably the best spiritualist advice I had ever gotten in my life was don't be naive.
And that I think is very good advice for life. Do you think that kind of those issues derive from, or potentially at the time, um, derive from like a lack of I don't know what the right word, like licensing, right? Because different groups you have like with Freemasonry, you have charters, so it's like I can't just go and start Cameron's Masonic Club in my living room and charge people money or whatever it is. Like I have to, if I want to be quote unquote an official Masonic body, I have to contact the Grand Lodge. I have to ask for permission to start a lodge. I have to show them the other people are going to be with me and show them where I'm going to be meeting and like do all these steps to um, uh, before I granted a charter and have permission, right? And obviously, I can still if I so desired, start Cameron's Masonic Club. The issue is anybody who joins the club isn't going to be able to visit any other lodges, right? They're not going
Right.
to be considered a Mason anywhere but in my living room or whatever it is, right? And it seems like one thing you talked about in what you sent me, and I'm wondering if this is maybe a more modern attempt by the spiritualist community to deal with some of those past issues, because we had them in Freemasonry as well. We had clandestine lodges and who's a real Mason, who's not, all that type of stuff. Is the idea of like, it's not just, yes, you have the Declaration of Principles, but you also have, there's age requirements, and there's also like, there's also, you can call yourself whatever you want, I guess, but if you actually be part of one of these camps, there's a process to go through and some type
Yes.
of training, right? Is that a more modern, I say modern, 19, 20th century, 21st century way to deal with some of those past issues that Freemasonry has had as well? Almost every group has had them.
I feel that's probably that was their intention. Was to almost exactly how you've talked about Freemasonry before, where people have this innate ability. Like there's people, most Freemason or Masons were people who had a natural love and ability to work with stones, right? And you see naturals like that when it comes to people who have what I call sensitivities. Certain people came along and they're like, wait a minute, there's like a wild balance of like no standard or inconsistency of standards, and there needs to be this standardized place. And so they started building a program to create that standardization. And also when you do that, once again, just because you're building that, just because you go through the process doesn't mean that you really understand what's going on. And you can potentially pass the test because you can memorize things, or because you can do the things you need to in the moment, but that doesn't mean you necessarily are a natural, or that you have the capacities to do the job, the competency levels to do the jobs necessary. um so
Although, I mean, that's kind of the risk you take, right? Like
yes, yes,
because I think that's true for almost any standard of any group, right? It's like, do you understand, or it's like the Chinese room um test, right?
yes,
Where it's like, if somebody gives me a book and phonetically tells me how to like speak in Chinese, I may be able to phonetically say the right words, but that doesn't mean I have any clue what I'm saying necessarily, right?
yes,
But I
yes,
mean, at a certain point, I mean, that kind of to me would come down to the teachers in a big way, right? Like when I'm mentoring a newer Mason in their ritual work, because to advanced degrees, you have to do memorization, you have to memorize passages. I'll always try to stop them and ask them, like, that last sentence, you got it correct. You said the right words, but you know what it means. Do you understand what the words mean? Um, and both, that's a good way to help make sure they always remember the memorization and they get the words right, but also because you don't want them to just memorize, you want them to actually understand
yeah.
what's being said.
And in spiritualism, after you go through a series of tests, then you have to be sponsored to go any higher. So someone in the community who's already a reverend has to sponsor you in your process to going further. So there's even levels within the levels.
So going back to what you had mentioned earlier, which is always good advice, don't be naive. I'm not going to mention any names. If anybody's watching this, they might know what I'm talking about. But for some people who may be struggling with being naive in some ways or about certain things, like what are some of the ways that either you as an individual or what you've seen from the spiritualist community kind of guard against naivete, right? I assume one of the big things is being careful that you're not always getting the answer that you want, might be one issue, right? Or so what are some of the guardrails you have against naivety?
For me, that looks much like just being honest about the situation and taking the time to watch it, to not make a predetermined judgment. Because sometimes if my bias is for something, that can create problems, but if it's against something, it can create problems as well. So really watching things and just seeing how they're working out as they're held to the universal principle, right? Um, Also, as a metaphysician, we're firm believers in a person's life will show you the type of person that they are. And so to utilize that information as valuable information to ourselves in the process. Um, and not ever putting the expectation on people. We see this a lot in spiritualism. People come in and they have an expectation for things, and when we have expectations, sometimes it can be easy to overlook the things that are staring us in the face.
I agree. I mean, I agree. Expectations is right. I think that the actual quote is like comparison is a thief of joy, but I suspect expectations is a thief of joy more than comparison, right? Expectation is being disappointed in advance
It's a
in some ways.
premeditated lie to yourself, an expectation is.
That's
Yeah,
a good way
because
to put it. Yeah,
yeah, because you're just
I'd
making
agree.
it up. We don't know. You never know. So
Right.
yeah, and being honest with yourself, once again, it's great not to be naive to the world, but definitely don't be naive to yourself. You'll know, when as I've walked through my path, I started trusting that space in myself, right? You start to just be like, okay, this is my discernment is kicking in, not my judgment of things, but my discernment. And I think it just kind of helps us navigate with a little more grace and ease, especially when you start talking about a spiritualist camp, because they'll say things like the center of light or a center of light or a respite of light, but it's always important to be mindful with every flame comes a shadow. So once again, and that's one thing kind of great about spiritualism is because we learn that all shades of light are relevant and they're all here. So how to work with them in the best way that we can so we don't have that naive sense of love and light only, or all these things that people say that aren't really conducive to they wouldn't stand up to natural law in the first place, but they're also not necessarily healthy for the person or the society around them.
Yeah, right. Well, and I liked also what you said about when you talk about kind of avoiding naivety. Taking your time, and kind of slowing things down, because you see that with scam artists a lot, right? One of the tricks, they have lots of different tricks obviously, but one of the tricks, and I bring this up because we have lots of Masons who are older and have unfortunately fallen for some of these scams, is especially financial scams, right? One of the tricks is you create that false sense of urgency
Hmm.
about whatever it is. So like there was that movie Boiler Room, which explored it really well, where they were selling basically junk stocks, right? But they would call somebody and be like, I need your answer in 2 minutes because this stock is going through the roof. And it's like, if he had said I need your answer in 2 weeks, it gives the guy a chance to think about it and kind of assess the situation more intelligently. But if he has 2 minutes to decide and he's afraid he's going to miss out, and et cetera, et cetera. So first, I mean, I always suggest this, and this is true for Freemasonry too, by the way. If anybody is ever talking to a Masonic group or lodge, and they're saying like, you need to join in the next week, then they're probably full of shit, right? They're probably clandestine. But saying if anybody is ever telling you like, we need your money now, probably pretty important to take a break and take a step back and even meditate for a few minutes before you decide that this is what you want to do, because false sense of urgency is a very powerful tool to trick people.
Yes, I agree.
And that's, again, you talked, even going back to the start, right? You talked about meditation as this idea of being aware of oneself, and again, this sense of urgency. And there's other tricks they do, but it's one of the ways they try to get you to lose that sense of self, right? To
Yeah.
get wrapped up. So have you found, through, you had your 20 years in the private sector, your 4 years in the more spiritual sector, have you found that your ability to kind of maintain awareness of yourself or regain awareness of yourself if it's slipping, has that improved over the last 4 years through some of these meditative practices? And what does that look like for you if you start to get stressed or something's happening and you feel like you're starting to lose that sense of self? What are some of the ways you get that back?
For the first question, I tell people all the time, meditation didn't just change my life; it changed the game I was playing. It changed everything for me, which is why I teach it today. Um, and what that looks like to me now is I often found myself before this part of my journey kind of being a puppet to the environment around me as well as my own emotions. I would just become, I would become engaged and that would just kind of come out as it came out and I would rationalize it. And because I'm clever, a lot of times my rationalizations would make sense, so I would get away with crappy behavior. you know? And once I started seeing that as I was going through my path, meditation allowed me to consciously take the moments to breathe. So when, especially working in recovery early in my process, the a lot of chaos happens in the walls of recovery, and there would be times I would go into my domineering mode and ordering people into rooms and stuff like that, and what meditation allowed me to do was to realize that I was becoming a puppet to my emotions because of the situation, and take a breath and say, you know what, guys, actually just give me 5 minutes. I'm gonna go to the office. I'm gonna take a few breaths and I'm gonna be back and then we're gonna talk about this, right? And so it not only allowed me to learn to self-regulate, but it allowed me to help display to the people in the environment around me who were unable of self-regulating at the time how to better take care of themselves and to know that it was okay if you're out of control for a minute, right? That's okay. And also, when you realize you're out of control, it's your responsibility, just like it was my responsibility, right? To go take those 5 minutes and to voice that to people, right? Because if I don't know your needs and, it's just going to be, butting heads back and forth because we're fighting over this thing that, you know, um, we're just not seeing eye to eye on because everything's so chaotic. It also looks for me much like being able to sit with people and allow them to talk. I still interrupt sometimes because I get really excited about what, me and people are talking about, but also it's allowed me whenever I feel myself getting excited as you're talking to be able to just take some breaths and listen to you instead of focusing on what I'm going to say later, right? I can actually stop and listen to you and hear you out and get a full body of where you're coming from, and those dynamics are really beneficial and they radiate outwards because it unintentionally once again shows other people another way that they might not be used to. um, and one of my favorite um, Ram Dass again, he always says, don't try to fix it all. He said, at best, you're going to get 1 second of response time for every year that you practice, right? But whenever you get 1 second of response time, that can make all the difference in the world. Think about all the things that happen in 1 second. People
I would agree with
die,
that
they get
completely.
shot, they get stabbed, they get punched, they divorce. I mean, all kinds of things happen in just 1 second. So if you really think about the dynamics of that, and if everyone, when they realized that they were overwhelmed, could just take 1 second. I mean, just think of the resonant value of that.
I mean, you talked earlier about, so I'm not sure how to put this question exactly, but you talked earlier about kind of a recognition in the spiritual community that there is no other, right? There is this, for lack of a better term, kind of different parts of the same thing, the infinite intelligence. Um, but going back to this idea of having the recognition of yourself and like internally not allowing yourself to be a puppet of emotions, how then, so I can, from when there is, for lack of a better term, another person, right, another who, um and well, we could say malevolence or otherwise. We'll start with the malevolent one, like let's say a scammer, somebody who is actively trying to um push you to lose yourself, again, create that sense of urgency that's not necessary or whatever it might be, right? Or somebody who maybe not purposefully, but otherwise is just very annoying. Like when it's an outside force influencing you, how do you find the same techniques are working in terms of buying that second of reaction time and bringing yourself back to you, or do you find it easier or harder when, because in some cases I know for people who have been in recovery, right, sometimes the issues, the triggers, they come from nobody is around. It just comes from something that internal, but sometimes it can be an external force coming in and causing all sorts. So do you find it's the same process when it's somebody else creating the challenges?
Okay, so there's a couple things in that. The first one would be to switch the perspective that nothing is happening to me. It's simply happening, right? And I'm engaged by it. So it's not this person is engaging me, but I'm engaged by this situation. So it becomes more of a self-discovery rather than a placing blame on something or trying to figure something out here out. And when we start talking, you sort of went into the being in recovery and sometimes things happening out of nowhere. That goes into more of the holistic practitioner part of it. So whenever someone is in a deep state of trauma or stuck in survival mode, their physical body tenses. And whenever a body does that for so long, plus they have all these repressed and suppressed emotions on top of that, there will actually become these physical energy points within the physical body. So, because there's that heightened level of constant survival on the inside, they could be sitting there reading a book and everything is so peaceful. And all of a sudden they're like, like, and because they're not in a space where they understand what's going on internally, they're going to try to put that on whatever's going on in the room. And sometimes that might be a person, and the person's like, they have no idea, because the person is in survival mode. And that's why it kind of another reason meditation is productive, because if I'm okay, right, I'm a meditator, I'm someone who's okay, my body, mind and heart are stabilized, and I see, I'm in a room with someone and they're just reading a book and all of a sudden they jump up and they're like, you know blame, all of a sudden pointing a finger at me and blaming me for all this stuff. I can allow them space to express that. I can go over to them. Maybe one thing I like to do with people is go over to them, just place both of my, like a hand on each side. I look them in the eye and I say, let's just take a breath together real quick and then we'll talk about it, okay? And then we can take a breath together. And then I can be like, okay, let's start over. Because that breath, it brings everything back here, right? Because if I'm acting reactively, it's because I'm out here somewhere. I'm not with myself anymore, right? I'm either in the past, I'm in the future, or I'm just completely disassociated, which is why this function isn't sitting steady at the moment, right? So it allows that responsible response with other people.
The the interpersonal nature of, I mean, life really, right? But Freemasonry, pick your group, right? I think that that is kind of what my interest in talking to you, spiritualism, it kind of, that's where it kind of comes from, the because it seems to me that, and there's lots of different reasons for that, and there's just this movie that came out called Join or Die, which was based on the Robert Putnam book Bowling Alone in the 90s, about the declining rates of membership in social groups and church attendance and civic
Mhm.
organizations since the 60s through to 2025, right? And I think one area where I don't think we've talked about it enough. So Putman, a lot of what he puts on it is technology, the number of people who have TVs now versus the 1960s, number of people who have phones now versus the 1960s. And he kind of talks about it in the sense of technology, along with other things. But one thing I think that he kind of misses a little bit is it's not the technology itself, it's this combination of the technology has kind of atrophied our ability to develop these interpersonal relationships. And I think with spiritual, right, because a phone will never give me pushback in theory. If I just press whatever button I want to press and it does what I want it to do, or the TV, you don't have to like navigate anything, right? And I think that is one of the tools that you and meditation and spiritualism have to offer is reminding us of how to work in situations and groups where it's not always going to go our way, or it's not always going to, my phone may do whatever I want, but that doesn't mean that Joe Smith down the street, and how to deal with the disappointment of somebody not doing what you want or whatever it is, right? Because that's
Yeah.
part of Freemasonry. There's votes in the lodge, and sometimes the vote goes your way, sometimes it doesn't, right? It's this idea of like, that seems to me something that spiritualism has to offer, and that I think kind of taps into what your last answer was, right? The idea of like how to deal with the disappointment of or those disappointing moments in life and with people, and not allowing it to interfere with relationships, because I do think our interpersonal skills do seem to be atrophying a lot, and our ability to be in groups that don't always get along, and how to figure out ways to get along in those situations.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of that in many different ways. Um, I don't have to like what you say, right? Like, and it's not your responsibility to make me happy, right? Or to say what I have to say. But there's been this push for, instead of an individuated consciousness, for rather we push the individual. And I think that's kind of the differential there is, whenever when I know that God isn't out there, right? My Not only God's not out there, but my validation is not out there, that it's in here. And I can connect with myself deeply. I can connect with you deeply because I feel safe. Right. And when you were talking about technology and stuff, like you said, my phone's not going to do this, not going to do that. That's safety, right? My phone's not going to reject me, right? My YouTube channel's not going to reject me. These things aren't going to reject me, and that feels safe to us. But if I, just say me and you met, there's a potential that I might reject you or you might reject me. And if I let that stand, and if I let the anticipation of how bad that's going to hurt affect me before I even get a chance to meet you, guess what's probably not going to happen? I'm probably not going to meet you, right? So I've just given up an opportunity to experience something, which is God, right? When we can sit in the experience of life and be there fully present with it, that is offering divinity to ourselves, to the person in front of us, and to all that's around us. And we just, the systems that have been formed for the past 150 years have done their darndest to disconnect us from God, to disconnect us from ourselves, and disconnect us from each other. And also, it is our responsibility, if we wish to see that change, to start taking the very profound steps and the intense process to do something different.
And so, what are some of the different things, right, that you would suggest we start to try? And again, we can tie this into Freemasonry, or I say more to general, like the Robert Putnam, the join or die kind of thesis, right? Well, it's not a thesis. The the facts of it are I think pretty undeniable, right? Which is membership in groups. I'd imagine the spiritualist camps you talked about are the same, but the membership in these groups is dropping significantly, whether it be churches, Freemasonry, right? And you saw them. You saw the great boom period be in the 1920s, at least for Freemasonry, and again 1950s. Much of it was actually fueled by soldiers returning from war and looking for, I think, and I've talked to soldiers who said, they were most likely looking to recreate the sense of camaraderie they felt in the trenches by joining groups, as well as continuing service, right? They fought for the country overseas. They come back. They're looking for still ways to contribute. Interesting enough, you didn't see that same boom of soldiers returning after Vietnam, which I think there's a lesson or two in there. But so now you've seen this decline since the 60s on, right? And I agree, we need to start doing some things differently. And this would apply to Freemasons, any group, the Rotary Club, churches, mosques. What would you say are some of the things that you think we need to maybe do differently in order to potentially reverse some of these trends and reconnect with each other?
Reconnect with ourselves. So, getting in deep contact with yourself, right? Like understanding what intimacy means to myself, right? Like when I know what emotional intimacy looks like, what physical intimacy looks like, what spiritual intimacy looks like, what technological intimacy looks like, when I can be vulnerable and intimate with myself, I can be vulnerable and intimate with other people. I can be connected with other people. And also, in saying that, there's a lot of junk sometimes when we get in there. And I feel one of the most profound things that we can ever do for other people is to take care of ourselves. And to be our own best friend. So to be your own wise counsel, um, not focus so much on, because we see this a lot when people come into psychology or spiritualism, is they immediately want to help other people, but they don't even have their own steady foundation, right? So learning how to speak to yourself in a constructive way, right? Being mindful of your own speech patterns in your head. Like, where do you find your thoughts going? When you hear yourself telling stories about situations, what do those conversations sound like? And how are they a reflection of the way you treat yourself? You know?
No, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially what you said about people wanting to help right away without themselves being set, right? Codependency is a thing. Right? One of the best ways to not deal with your problems is to try to take on somebody else's.
Yes.
Um, and it can give a false sense of altruism as well, right? Because it's like how can I, look at me being so good and trying to help this person, where meanwhile they might have actually problems that are less than you, right? It's being kind to yourself is a real thing, right? You're a person too, and if you're whether you're kind to your neighbor or kind to yourself, it's still kindness to a person or helping a person.
And once again, as a metaphysician, I know how you feel about yourself by the way you treat the world around you. I know your internal world simply by the way you are with the world. And, if we can all be honest about our own lives in that way, I can be honest with my life about, I know when I go in and I'm a certain type of way, it's reflected on the way I'm feeling on the inside, and I take that responsibility, and not to say that it's better or worse than anybody, but what I can tell you when I learned to take that responsibility and I decided to take it consistently and moment to moment rather day to day, it allowed me to move with a lot more grace and ease. And, I can't promise miracles to anyone, but I think we can all use a little bit more grace and ease.
I would agree with that. I think that's very, very, very true.
Mm.
And with that, so what I will say once again is anybody who's watching this, if you're a Mason, whether you're a worshipful master or just or an apprentice or brand new, if anything we've said here in terms of, for example, meditation in a Masonic meeting seems valuable to you, then I'll leave a link for Black Bear Meditation, their website. You can find some information there, and maybe bring it up to your master and suggest that you try to incorporate a 10-minute meditation at the start of a meeting and see how it goes. Not every armadillo makes it across the road. I'm not suggesting every lodge, it'll work and be successful, but why not try it, right? And if you are like most Masonic lodges and you know losing members or numbers, then what's the harm in trying it? I think trying it can only result in something beneficial, at least, because I didn't mention this before, I think, but during the pandemic we were doing virtual meetings and we did a virtual meditation. We had a Mason from St. Louis, um yeah, St. Louis, Missouri, he was a brother, but he did meditative practices. He guided us in a meditation. So, give it a shot. It's worth it. And Black Raven Meditation has some really awesome um, resources for you to check out. And also, I mean, that's not all you guys do at Black Raven. I saw one of your most recent streams. Do you actually perform? Because you were talking about it. Do you actually do like professional dream interpretation, or is that because I
Yeah, I'm
saw
a
on
meta
the thing you're
I'm a
talking about dream?
metaphysician, so I use all the modalities in the process.
So, I mean, as somebody who loves Nightmare on Elm Street, I saw that. I thought that was really cool. But if you guys wanted, I mean, what are some of the other services that Black Raven Meditation provides? Dream analysis, guided meditations. What else?
Oh my gosh, it's hard to go down the list of all these things. We work with numerology. My big thing, I work a lot with meditation. Like I meditate at the Humane Society with the animals. I developed an energy process that I use in hospice for people who are transitioning. Um, but yeah, flame messages, tarot cards, I utilize them, but it's not so much for me about utilizing them. It's about utilizing them in a way that teaches a person how to utilize it in their own life in a productive way, in a grounded way that actually helps them make actionable changes. Because you can learn all the things, but if you don't know how to apply them, we're missing the point. So we work a lot more with the applied metaphysics of things. So most people would consider what I do metaphysical counseling. My background is a psych background. Yeah, we do a lot of Eastern uh, mystery things, but once again, I strive to keep it all very applicable to human and to the right now human, because to me, that's once again where the temple of God resides.
Out of curiosity, um, because I remember talking to somebody else. I met her. I'm trying to look it up now, trying to get the information correct. Um, I'm not sure if you know who was it. It's gonna drive me crazy now. Elena content. I'm gonna do it that way. Episode 170. Elena Gorley, celebrate every step. So she was or she is a counselor. She does similar things to yourself. She did tarot readings. She did spiritualist readings and stuff. She was talking about the like apparently some of her services were covered by different insurance companies and stuff like that in the States. Is yours as well? Just out of curiosity.
Yes, because of my certifications and yes, yes, the people charge. So basically, my business itself is a cooperative environment, but I spend most of my time outside of BRM volunteering my time. I don't put prices on anything. So even what we do in Black Raven Meditation, I have never set a price list. It's a cooperative environment. Whatever the time is worth to you is what you're welcome to contribute. And sometimes that simply looks like someone's willingness to put the work into action in their own lives. That's the
Very
most
cool.
important thing to me. And, my work with the when I got started, when I went from clinical to holistic, and then I was like, both of these are missing some things. And then I started working with getting holistic back into mainstream, but getting it into mainstream in a way where we could set a standard for how the practitioner process should look. And that's what we've been working on for the past 2 years is really getting into the mainstream stuff with our holistic process and getting people open to the idea of what it is and how it benefits everyone. Because it doesn't, this is the great thing about the holistic work we do. It doesn't just benefit the clients we work with, it benefits the people in our environment that we're working with, right? Because we can we allow a space to be open about the realities of what's going on, which sometimes is lost in clinical environments. It's in a clinical environment, you're often expected to kind of keep it a certain way or keep it in a box. And the holistic approach allows us to open up that box a little bit, and fill in some of the gaps for people because people we're not one size fit all, but we have all these programs that are one size fit all. And most of the programs people have been through multiple times, especially when we talk about the recovery community. Those people have been through that same program 6, 7 times, sometimes more. And if it's not working, it's not working. So the holistic aspect allows us to open that up a little bit more and be more compassionate with people and be more realistic about what's going on right here, right now.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you always being on the live streams and also appreciate you taking the time for this interview. Like I said, anybody watching this, I'll leave the Black Raven meditation link in the description. Also, check out the YouTube channel. There's always some cool stuff on there as well. It seems what I saw is it seems to me you do primarily live streams. You do podcasts as well, or is it mostly live streams? Is what it looked like when I was.
When it comes to YouTube, I consider myself a gonzo creator.
All right, there you go.
Whatever strikes my soul in the moment, that's just kind of what we do.
Well, Hunter S. Thompson was a very smart guy, so I support that. All righty.
Mhm.
Well, have a great night. Thank you again for being on here. I really appreciate it, and thank you for all your work. And hopefully, we will start to see some more meditation in our Masonic lodges. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you.